It's an absolute pleasure to be in Cavan. The future book really came out of the last book, in that when you spend enough time in the border, you realise how transient it is in terms of personal and social ties. All of you know very well, of course, but when I was doing a lot of research in Fermanagh, I began to realise that how many people who from a Unionist, Loyalist background were sort of originally had connections or were from or had family in of course, Cavan, but also in Donegal and Monaghan. So I began to explore that a bit in terms of looking at what some people in Unionism, particularly in Fermanagh and Tyrone, who rejected the exclusion of the three counties from the Ulster Unionist Council, began to call the lost counties, right? So the three counties and the kind of sense of betrayal that the Ulster Unionist Council had ejected frontier loyalists, who many thought were the most loyal, the most ardent of all. So this is just a picture of Stradone Company of the Ulster Volunteer Force. I'm not really going to do a sort of long PowerPoint tonight. I'm actually going to do the more conventional academic thing of reading a paper. And there's a reason for that. I'm very conscious of where I am, and I want to get the details right, particularly not only about geography, but also about, because this is a paper in which I go into quite a lot of detail about local small resistance groups in various parts of Cavan that sometimes fought back against the IRA during the War of Independence. And that story I think it needs to be told quite carefully. So I want to do it as accurately as possible. On the morning of the 11th of February 1922, two Cavan loyalists, Special Constables Robert McMahon and David Morton, departed from Newtonard's camp for Enniskillen. McMahon, the son of an RIC pensioner, was part of 12th platoon of the A-class Ulster Special Constabulary. Morton, who until a few months previously had lived on his family's farm in Cavan, served in 11th platoon. The men travelled with a party of 17 other constables and a sergeant. Only 6 of the constables were armed. Shortly before 5 p.m, the train crossed the new border between Northern Ireland and what became the Irish Free State, stopping in Clones, where the Ulster Special Constabulary party disembarked before boarding a connecting train to Enniskillen. The appearance of the Specials south of the border was remarkably ill-timed. Days earlier, the Monaghan pro-treaty IRA had kidnapped a number of prominent Fermanagh and Monaghan loyalists. This was a reprisal, of course, for the arrest of the Monaghan footballers, IRA officers who were arrested in Northern Ireland and were suspected of planning an attack in Derry. At approximately 5:35, shooting broke out in Clones Station between the IRA and the Ulster Special Constabulary. Matt Fitzpatrick, the leader of the IRA in Clones, and 4 A Specials, including Robert McMahon, were killed. 9 constables were wounded. David Morton and 6 other constables were taken prisoner by the IRA and held for more than a fortnight. The deceased, Robert McMahon, grew up in Tuam near Black Lion, where his father retired after serving in the RIC. The Morton farm was in Ardoo near Ballyconnell. Both were border loyalists who found themselves defending, and in McMahon's case dying for, a Northern Ireland which had excluded their native places in Ulster. The Morton homestead in Ardoo was separated from Northern Ireland by the intersecting waters of Loch Macnain. Other Cavan loyalists owned lands or had houses on both sides of the border. Fred Tilson from the townland of Leggy Kelly in County Cavan relocated 100 yards or so into County Fermanagh. He basically had a barn and he turned it into a house in Fermanagh as opposed to his former residence in Cavan. A member of the part-time B Specials, his house was raided by Free State soldiers who crossed the border on 2nd of February 1923 in retaliation for an incursion by the Special Constabulary a few days previously. Tilson was later accused of pretending to be an IRA volunteer, arrested by the Royal Ulster Constabulary and accused of robbing a neighbour called William Pogue, but after a robust character reference by his local Special Constabulary commander, he was found not guilty. Fred Tilson's ability to transform himself overnight into a citizen of Northern Ireland while remaining in the same locality was self-evidently an option only available to the very few. Much of Cavan's Protestant population lived away from the border towards the county's frontier with Leinster. The Protestant population in the most rural parts of the county was also more dispersed, even if small pockets of strength were centred around the districts of Arva in the southwest, Billis in the southeast, Stradone in the east, and Ashfield or Kildrumsheridan in the northeast of the county. These demographics had obvious ramifications for any potential resistance to the IRA. Loyalist paramilitary activity or defence networks in Cavan during the War of Independence have generally been overlooked. This is understandable since Cavan loyalists failed to mount a sustained challenge to the IRA similar to the intensity of that seen in Monaghan. Nevertheless, as Brian Hughes has observed, the UVF was certainly alive in Cavan in 1920 and 1921. Hughes has therefore called for more research into Loyalist paramilitary activity in Cavan during this period. Daniel Purcell has valuably sifted through the dying embers of unionism in the county. He argued that Cavan's Protestants' intense embrace of Ulsterism in the early 20th century was, to a large extent, transactional. Irish loyalism was faring badly. Ulster unionism was a more vibrant force then to hitch the Cavan Protestant interest. It is difficult to clearly separate out opportunism from conviction a century after events, particularly at a non-elite level. Like any political ideology, Ulster loyalism may have been fervently embraced by some within the Protestant community, or viewed cynically or disparagingly by others. Jonathan Cherry, writing in the same edited volume as Purcell, noted that a persistent complaint from Arthur Kenlis Maxwell, 11th Baron Farnham, was that the exclusion of the county from what became Northern Ireland denied Cavan loyalists their, quote, ancestral rights to their Ulster identity. Historically, Farnham was of course correct. Cavan Protestants had more claim than Monaghan, and an equivalent claim is Donegal to an integral connection with the events of the Ulster plantation. Recent research by David Leahy demonstrated that Cavan Protestants, even in areas like Ballymekew near the Longford border, were and are very aware of their plantation lineage, including handed down tales of ancestors' involvement in the Jacobite-Williamite wars in the province. This paper will argue then that an Ulster connection should not be dismissed as merely transactional. Both elements, ideological commitment and opportunistic political leverage, were likely at play within Cavan's attachment to the Ulster movement. There are then several theories that account for a curious absence of bark or bite from Cavan loyalism during the War of Independence. The first is that Cavan was one of the quieter counties in Ireland when it came to IRA activity, and that there was correspondingly a low-key loyalist response. Union O'Halpin and Daithí O'Coran have identified only 12 conflict-related fatalities that took place within Cavan during the War of Independence. Aegon O'Farrell and Fergal McGarry have persuasively also argued that the most concerted Republican campaign was, of course, not one of violence, but of law. Republican courts and the co-option of the administration of local government were a very effective means of Sinn Féin undermining Britain's writ in Cavan. Many Protestants moved pragmatically then to recognise rather than oppose these courts. The Cavan IRA was later split between divisions, two of which were led by particularly dynamic leaders. West Cavan Brigade reported to Longford Republican Sean McKeown, the commander of 1st Midland Division, while much of East Cavan was included in the 3rd Brigade area, part of Ona Duffy's 5th Northern Division. However, the imposition of a more coherent brigade division structure only practically took effect in the late spring of 1921. The influence of McKeown and O'Duffy in Cavan was consequently quite limited for much of the War of Independence. No similarly potent Republican leader emerged in Cavan. Some smaller parts of the county fell under the influence of other IRA commanders. Virginia Company, the IRA, for example, reported to what later became 3rd Meath Brigade, part of 1st Eastern Division. An inherent risk of organising more overt loyalist paramilitary activities, such as training or patrolling in the open, like in Monaghan, risked provoking rather than suppressing IRA activity. The danger of such bungled loyalist resistance is illustrated by the case of Rathkenny near the town of Cootehill. Here, an IRA battalion, one that had a relatively modest record in attacking the police and military, scored a series of decisive victories against a local loyalist paramilitary network. Quietism was a much safer bet. In 1911, a significant majority of Cavan's Protestants, approximately 17,000 in number or 18.5% of the county's population, belonged to the Church of Ireland. Anglican clergymen in the county played a prominent role in the Ulster movement. Parishioners, therefore, may have felt some social obligation to sign the Ulster Covenant or to join the UVF. By the summer of 1914, the Cavan regiment of the UVF was both well organised and well armed. The Cavan UVF was split into 3 battalions under the overall command of Colonel Oliver Nugent of Farranconnell near Ballymekew. Nugent's second in command was Major Henry Nugent Head, a British Army officer who was married to Rosa Saunderson, daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Saunderson, one of Ulster Unionism's most important early leaders. Oliver Nugent was, of course, a highly capable soldier who would go on to command the 36th Ulster Division in the First World War. During the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 1914, Nugent was determined to avoid unnecessary conflict with nationalists. The exposed position of Cavan's Unionists meant that he viewed the Ulster Volunteers as primarily a defensive movement, one to resist aggression rather than take part in offensive activities. To this end, he renamed the county's UVF the Cavan Volunteer Force to distinguish it from the more aggressive posture taken by the UVF's Belfast leadership. In contrast to Nugent, one of his battalion commanders, Lord Farnham, was regarded in wider Ulster Unionist circles as, quote, a hawk. Unlike in Monaghan and Donegal, it is hard to find evidence for a dynamic, younger and non-aristocratic officers in the Cavan UVF. In the case of Donegal and Monaghan, many of these younger officers were Presbyterians. Cavan's Protestants were, of course, overwhelmingly Anglican. Social hierarchies, therefore, may have limited non-elite Loyalist dynamism in the county. Arguably, the greatest single blow to the Cavan UVF regiment during the First World War was the death of Lieutenant Colonel Audley Pratt of Cabra Castle. Pratt was the charismatic and much decorated commanding officer of 11th Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, previously 9th Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers, of course, regiment associated with Cavan men recruited to, of course. General Nugent rated him as one of his most outstanding officers, which was a very hard-won accolade from the most demanding of commanders in the British Army. Cavan's leading unionists forcefully resisted proposals in 1916 to exclude the three counties from a future Home Rule Bill. Major Somerset Saunderson and Travers Blackley, Lord Farnham's land agent, made clear to the Ulster Unionist Council that they regarded any such proposal as, quote, a gross breach of the pledge under which the men of the Ulster Division went to the front. Such a statement was undoubtedly given added weight by Nugent's command, but Sir Edward Carson made clear that he resented Saunderson's accusations of betrayal, writing that the exclusion of the three counties was a requirement of, quote, imperial emergency due to the war. Moreover, it was likely the best outcome to which the Ulster Unionist Council could realistically aspire. Other three-county unionists, such as the UUC delegates from Monaghan, declined to mount a concerted campaign of opposition to Carson's leadership during the wartime. Carson indeed singled out the Monaghan delegates for praise in contrast to Cavan's truculence. Despite later claims that acquiescence to, or at least a refusal to oppose such a proposal, was only valid within the context of a wartime emergency, a damaging precedent of Ulster partition had been set, even if the subsequent Home Rule negotiations collapsed during the latter half of 1916. Nonetheless, Cavan Unionists greeted the end of the First World War on 11th November 1918 with patriotic delight. Fireworks were let off at the Farnham estate, a sports day was held at Kilmore Cathedral, and celebratory marches were also organised in Red Hills and Ballyconnell. Outward signs of imperial fealty and confidence masked Cavan Loyalists' profound vulnerability. Cavan, along with Monaghan and Donegal, would again be excluded from what became Northern Ireland under the 1920 Government of Ireland Act. Arms raids then during the Anglo-Irish War of Independence, depending on which terminology you prefer, were a persistent threat to rural loyalists in Cavan during 1920 and 1921. Some of these were based on accurate information. UVF leaders were, of course, well known in the county. Drilling had taken place in the open. However, loyalists also took precautions such as hiding weapons and farms. Indeed, in an interview in 2019, a descendant of a Cavan loyalist recounted how he found weapons that had been buried on his family farm some decades earlier during, quote, the troubled years. Such precautions frustrated an arms-deprived IRA in the county. Even large operations or sweeps of loyalist houses often netted only small amounts of weapons. The UVF seems to have been partially reactivated in some parts of the county, resisting the boycott of Belfast goods and organising defence networks. But armed loyalist paramilitary activity was relatively rare, again, compared to neighbouring Monaghan. Most of the erstwhile UVF leaders were absent, incapable or unwilling to lead loyalist resistance. The Saundersons abandoned their home in Upper Lough Erne, which had been targeted and damaged by the IRA. And indeed, some former proselytisers for the Ulster movement quickly lost faith in armed paramilitary resistance after partition. During a 12th of July demonstration in 1920, Reverend Richard Martin of Killashandra, a rector who had been so eager to recruit Ulster volunteers, now drew upon the Bible to convince the county's Orangemen to adopt a quietistic approach. Martin reminded Cavan's loyalists of, quote, the apostles' advice about being quiet, minding their own business, and if they did so, no matter what their politics might be, he was not one bit afraid of trouble in the county, unquote. Theophilus Lucas Clements, the 56-year-old former patron of the UVF in northeast Cavan, recommended an accommodation between Loyalists and Sinn Féin. Speaking in Drum in County Monaghan during the 12th of July demonstrations there in 1920, Lucas Clemens expressed a sense of optimism for the future. in contrast to the much more forlorn and defiant tone adopted by Monaghan's Orangemen. Quote, for themselves and their property, he honestly thought that there was no special danger. His own opinion was that Sinn Féin was a clean fighter, seeking mistakenly but honestly the welfare of Ireland, unquote. Lucas Clements then left Ireland, dying in Wales in 1921. Other patrician aristocratic leaders in the county, such as Robert Johnston and General Oliver Nugent, stayed. But these men, now in their 60s, appear to have played little, if any, role in Loyalist defence during 1919 to 23. Before his departure from Cavan for England in 1920, indeed he returned after the Civil War, Lord Farnham may have re-established a Loyalist paramilitary network in the county, or at least in his old 1st Battalion UVF area. James Black of Arva subsequently pointed out in his application to the British government's Irish Grants Committee that he joined Farnham's loyal volunteers, as he called them, after the closure of many police barracks in rural Cavan in the spring of 1920. On one occasion, a group of armed men claiming to be volunteers from A Company, 1st Battalion UVF, commandeered goods from a local Protestant shopkeeper. A group of Arva loyalists also took up arms on the night of 24th of September 1920 to try to frustrate an attack on the barracks. Most of the Balnia IRA battalion had been mobilised in a carefully planned operation devised by Sean McKeown and led by one of Longford Brigade's most capable officers, Captain Paddy Finnegan. Greatly outnumbered, the Arva loyalists scattered after an exchange of shots at an IRA roadblock outside the village. 2 sergeants and 8 constables eventually surrendered after an hour-long firefight. The decision not to overtly organise more intense armed loyalist resistance against the IRA during the War of Independence was an astute one. A positive or proactive offence would have stimulated an IRA reaction, leading to an auction of violence in Cavan in which loyalists would have been easily overpowered. But there were other breaks too in IRA activity, not least the Ancient Order Hibernians, which maintained a vibrant and quite antagonistic presence in Cavan throughout the War of Independence. Tensions between the Hibs and the IRA were often an unwelcome but consuming distraction for Republican volunteers. The most charismatic and capable Republican leader, Paul Galligan from Balnia, elected as Sinn Féin TD for West Cavan in 1918, was interned early in the conflict and not released until after the truce. An emerging IRA leader, Thomas Sheridan, was mortally wounded after an attack on the IRAC barracks of Balnia in May 1920. Seamus McDiarmid, the intelligence officer for the IRA's Cavan battalion, recalled that the IRA in Cavan was subsequently, quote, very unorganised. An attempt by IRA General Headquarters to liven up, as they called it, activity failed when Captain Joseph McMahon, who had been sent from Dublin to energise the campaign in the county, was killed while handling a bomb near Cavan town on 15th of August 1920. If such men had been active in the latter part of 1920, early 1921, then the conflict in Cavan could, of course, escalated sharply, including against Loyalists. 4 Protestants were killed by the IRA in Cavan from 1919 to 1923. More, of course, were wounded. The killing of Dean John Finlay, shop assistant William Ryan, and a young girl called Madge Livingston were, particularly horrific murders, which terrified the local Protestant population. The death of blacksmith Thomas Sadleir at Butler's Bridge, killed while resisting an IRA raiding party in 1922, was also likely to have shocked the local Protestant community. But the numbers of dead were relatively low. Moreover, as Cherry has demonstrated, 24 of the 34 great houses in Cavan remained intact and inhabited by their original owners in the decade after 1922. Again, quietism paid off, even if Loyalists had to put up with considerable harassment and destruction of property, especially during the Civil War period. Although slow to take up arms, Cavan's Loyalists resisted the IRA in other ways. RIC intelligence for Royal Irish Constabulary intelligence for 1920 and 1921 generally reported that the UVF was, quote, fairly active in the county. An interesting example of a British intelligence success in the area around Arva, an area where, despite the withdrawal of the RIC and the absence of a military presence, 10 of the 34 volunteers in the local IRA company were identified and later interned during 1920 and 21. It is difficult to trace the scale of such cooperation between the police and Loyalists, but given that Cavan was one of the most fertile recruiting grounds in Ulster for Protestants who joined the RIC, it seems probable that there were frequently used channels of information. The evacuation of RIC barracks in places like Arva and Ballyconnell were, of course, a costly mistake on the part of the police. A few months later, the RIC County Inspector reported that it was, quote, urgently necessary to reopen these police stations, unquote, since IRA units had taken full advantage of the police's absence. Brian Hughes concluded that the loss of UVF weapons seized during an IRA raid on the IRA raid on Arva RIC barracks in September 1920 was a significant blow to Loyalists seeking to organise resistance in the area. However, a large IRA find of UVF weapons during the truce period suggests that Arva Company, 1st Battalion Cavan UVF, had more weapons available. IRA volunteer Patrick Masterson recalled that he and a group of IRA volunteers captured 14 UVF rifles, 7 shotguns and 300 rounds of ammunition. 10 miles away near Killashandra, the local IRA company seized 25 rifles and some ammunition from Major William Hamilton. In areas with more sizable Protestant populations, particularly those close to larger towns, raids were much riskier for the IRA. Loyalists were more likely to resist if neighbours, the police or army could come to their aid. IRA volunteers in East Cavan claimed that they were up against an organised Loyalist defence network. An IRA intelligence report claimed that Harry Flood, a 25-year-old large farmer living near Rathkenny, was the commander of a 50-strong unit of what they called B Specials that operated in the area between Cootehill and Cavan town and was particularly active in Rathkenny, Drung and Tullivin. Resistance may have been more sporadic than IRA accounts suggested, but IRA volunteers were continuously fired upon when they raided Loyalist homes for weapons. As early as December 1919, John, George and Joseph Johnston of Drumlift near Castletara shot at an IRA raiding party. The family eventually surrendered and handed over their weapons after one of the brothers was wounded. On 3rd of January 1920, IRA volunteers from Cavan Battalion had to retreat from the house of William Turner, a farmer who lived at Cornegall, also near Castletara, after Vice Commandant Bernard Galligan was shot. The raiding party claimed that up to 10 armed, quote, specials defended the house. Since the special constabulary had not yet been established, it is more likely that Turner and his 3 sons, and possibly their neighbours, put up a determined defence of the property. IRA volunteers from Cavan Battalion also targeted the house of another farmer, Bob Evans, from Cornabase near Rathkenny. Again, under fire, the IRA raiders had to retreat without capturing any weapons. Castletara Company, part of Cavan Battalion, responded to Loyalist resistance by kidnapping local Loyalists who they claimed were, quote, specials, and keeping them prisoner for several days or weeks. It does not appear to have worked. George Scarlett of Plush beat off a raid by Castletara Company on his home in December 1920. The IRA returned some days later with a larger force. The occupants of the Scarlett house again opened fire, injuring an IRA volunteer. According to the IRA's account, after the raiding party in turn wounded one of the occupants and set fire to the house, George Scarlett surrendered along with 3 other men. James Martin, a lieutenant in Castletara Company, claimed that Scarlett's house was, quote, the HQ of the Ulster Specials of that district. The IRA also targeted those who were believed to be serving with the RIC, or the A Special, the full-time A Special Constabulary of the Ulster Special Constabulary, and to prevent schoolmasters from giving tuition to would-be RIC recruits. Those targeted included the family of William Rowntree, a former labourer on the Saunderson estate who lived near Clover Hill, and the Lawrence family from Inishmore near Butler's Bridge. The Rowntrees fired on the raiding party and, according to the IRA, a member of the family was wounded. Police came to the Rowntrees' aid, but the IRA volunteers were able to make good their escape. In 1921, the IRA in Cavan went on the offensive against the Loyalist paramilitary network in northeast Cavan, which again they believed was led by Harry Flood. They arrested 2 specials, Francis Brennan, who was 14 years old, and Samuel Hall, 21, from Drumgallen. Both are reported to be carrying a revolver. In May 1921, 15 IRA volunteers led by the Vice Commandant of Cavan Battalion, Bernard Galligan, surprised a meeting of, quote, specials at Rathkenny School and engaged in a sustained firefight for 10 minutes. Cootehill Battalion claimed to have shot 3 specials. These were Jim Courtney, William McKnight from Rathkenny and John Harley from Tullivin. McKnight was only 14 years old. The IRA captured 5 rifles and some ammunition. An IRA volunteer, Mick McGahern, a first lieutenant in Drum Company, was also seriously wounded. On 10th June 1921, Bernard Galligan, who was from nearby Drung, and a force of 20 IRA volunteers made another attack on the same, quote, special headquarters, the school. This time, the gunfight went on for half an hour before the occupants surrendered. Galligan's men captured 2 rifles and some ammunition. Patrick Walsh, the captain of the IRA's Castletara Company, also reported that he captured 8 rifles, 4 revolvers and some ammunition at the house of George Evans of Lurton. Evans was suspected of storing these for Rathkenny, quote, specials. Directly to the east of Cavan town, IRA's Lara Company raided the Burrows family of Stradone House, although it is not clear that they acquired any arms. William Patterson of Moneycast put up some resistance but later surrendered some weapons. In total, the IRA targeted over 25 houses in the Lara Stradone area, in addition to raiding orange halls in the area. Weapon seizures were relatively modest. During a 2-hour firefight at the Turner House in Lisleigh, The IRA claimed to have wounded one of the family and set the house on fire after the Turners initially refused to surrender. The family then handed over some weapons. While raiding the residence of Tom Thompson in April 1921, an IRA party was fired on from the house and from the nearby woods of the Stradone estate. Stradone was, of course, the land steward for the Burroughs family, and the IRA suspected one of his sons was a candidate for the RIC. The Thompsons successfully fought off the raiding party. Tom Thompson told a reporter that he had wounded one of the IRA volunteers. However, Lara Company IRA did have some success that night, capturing 3 UVF rifles and some Indian meal from other houses in the neighbourhood. The IRA returned to settle the score on the Burroughs estate, burning Stradone House in June 1921. In Knockbride, another rural district of relative Loyalist strength in East Cavan, IRA volunteers claimed they encountered resistance in 3 out of 4 houses raided for arms, and that most of the male inhabitants belonged to the UVF. Knockbride East Company failed to secure coveted UVF rifles during raids in late 1920, although some revolvers and shotguns were seized. In April 1921, after the arrest of 2 of its officers, the company carried out another round of raids on Loyalist houses. An alleged member of the UVF, William Bodie, fired on the raiding party from his house. In response, the Knockbride men shot out all the windows of the house. Bodie eventually surrendered and handed over a shotgun, a revolver and some ammunition. At the house of Thomas Pepper, Duhallet, the company claimed that they seized a UVF rifle and some ammunition. In southeast Cavan, Captain Thomas Smith of Virginia Company reported that during the summer of 1920, Loyalists, our quote, specials from Billis had formed a paramilitary unit in the area. Billis was a well-known recruiting area for the RIC, and together with nearby Gradham, an area of long-standing Orange and Loyalist strength. A popular RIC sergeant, Andrew Boyd, retired there in 1905. Boyd's wife was from Cavan. Their son John served for many years as the worshipful master at Billis Loyal Orange Lodge. Smith, with support from Killing Cross Company, organised a raid on Billis Orange Hall during a Loyalist drilling and firearms practice session in the summer of 1920. On approaching the hall, Smith claimed that Loyalists opened fire on him and his men. After half an hour, the IRA succeeded in taking the hall and capturing the arms and ammunition, which included Ulster rifles and shotguns, unquote. They also took a Union Jack as a trophy. In nearby Ballyjames-Duff, Commandant Hugh Maguire, commanding officer of Crusherlaw Battalion of the IRA, recalled meeting little or no resistance during raids for arms. Although he and his men recovered only a few UVF rifles. Crusherlaw was very short of active volunteers. Ballyjames-Duff Company, for example, could only muster 5. Meanwhile, volunteer Daniel MacDonald of Upper Lavey Company recalled being fired upon by a local Loyalist family called Jennings during a raid for arms. The family eventually surrendered a shotgun. Hugh Maguire also targeted serving RIC constables and potential recruits, including RIC Constable William Rooney, who was on leave at his parents' house at Gradham. On St. Patrick's Day 1921, Rooney was attacked by 5 IRA volunteers, including Daniel MacDonald, and shot. He suffered extensive shotgun and revolver wounds to one of his legs, which was later amputated, ending Rooney's police service. Maguire claimed that he had ordered such a shooting to, quote, disable Rooney, whereas MacDonald claimed that Rooney was shot because he had offered resistance. Rooney may have seen through the men's disguise. A police report later noted that 3 local men were now, quote, on the run. Local accounts suggested, however, that the Rooneys were very well regarded among their Catholic neighbours, who were, quote, shocked by the IRA attack on the family, and that William Rooney offered little, if no resistance. 5 days after the shooting of Rooney, the nearby Sinn Féin Hall in Crusherlaw was burned to the ground, in what the police reported was a Loyalist reprisal. Locals instead later blamed the RIC, or the Black and Tans, as they called it. In the spring and summer of 1920, Curlock Battalion, led by Commandant Pat Woods, commenced a series of raids against Loyalists. David Griffiths, a large farmer, creamery owner and magistrate who lived at Tonkin Road House near Ballyconnell, was shot in the leg. So the dynamics of violence in North West Cavan are a bit different here. A bomb was later placed at his house, which prematurely exploded, killing IRA volunteer John McIntyre. Woods' men also raided Boy House, the residence of Robert Johnston, County Grand Master of the Orange Order, Deputy Lord Lieutenant of the county and erstwhile UVF District Commander. Johnston claimed that his daughter was mistreated. She was recovering from a serious operation during the raid. The killing of 78-year-old Dean John Finlay, a retired Church of Ireland clergyman, on 12th of June 1921, punctured the confidence of the small and exposed Loyalist community in North West Cavan. The events that led to the death of Dean Findlay began with a visit by two British officers believed to be from the Auxiliary Division of the RIC to Brackley House in the spring of 1921. It was rumoured locally that the house was listed for future use as a billet or a post by the Army or the police. In early June 1921, Corlock Battalion decided to raid and burn the house. At some point during the raid, Findlay's murderer struck him on the head, probably with an iron bar. Dr. William O'Rourke, who conducted a post-mortem with another physician, concluded, quote, that the wound was caused by a blunt instrument being driven into the skull with considerable force. Findlay's murder prompted the departure of several Protestant families from the area. 2 months earlier, a Protestant farmer, John Harrison, had been brutally killed, shot as a suspected spy in nearby Drumreilly, just on the Leitrim side of the county border, not far from Killyran. He was killed by 3 volunteers, 2 of whom used shotguns. The injuries to his body, found in a nearby field by his 14-year-old son Oliver, were consequently horrific, giving rise to speculation that he'd been tortured or beaten to death with blunt instruments. Shotgun wounds are catastrophic that way. The murder of Dean Findlay took place at a time when the RIC and the British Army were beginning to reassert their authority in Leitrim and Cavan. IRA leaders had been arrested, killed or wounded in both counties. Belturbet Battalion complained of a lack of ammunition and, quote, the strong hostile orange element, unquote, whose intelligence role was a significant asset to the police and the military. The RIC began to reopen barracks that had been abandoned a year previously and reported that the renewed presence was, quote, having a good effect. The police and the military were learning. Bernard Sweeney, a survivor of the ambush to Sultan Hill, recalled that, quote, the days of surprising small parties of the enemy and disarming them had gone as they operated in much bigger formations now and with much greater strength, unquote. IRA units were constantly short of rifles and ammunition, and Sweeney was grateful that the truce came when it did. Now, in terms of the Civil War, well, of course, the British Army moves north, but they keep a very close eye on Cavan and the border counties. And so we get a sense then of, after the truce period, and particularly in early 1922, of the British continuing to gather intelligence south of the border, and all these are collected then in War Office military intelligence files, which make very interesting reading about Cavan. They obviously have very active sources and sometimes very accurate information that corresponds with the Irish military's, the National Army's own intelligence. At the end of 1922, a British Army, one of these intelligence reports offered a grim assessment of security in Cavan and Leitrim. Both counties were, quote, if not actually in the hands of the Republicans, at any rate not under the control of Free State troops. Anti-treaty, unquote, anti-treaty IRA frequently raided Protestant houses for weapons, money and supplies. What's interesting is some of the memories of this period later recorded say that, in 1922 my father's house was raided by the Black and Tans, but of course the Black and Tans are gone. But this is sort of the polite, sort of little misremembering that sometimes goes on in terms of certain traumatic incidents. The withdrawal of the British Army from the Free State, commencing of course in early 1922, and the disbandment of the RIC saw an increase in opportunistic raids and Loyalists, even before the commencement of the Civil War in June. Some of these were to have fatal consequences. And we talked, for example, about the killing of 55-year-old blacksmith Thomas Sadleir. The Sadleir were very well-known Loyalists. The Sadleirs were well-known Loyalists. The RIC believed that Thomas Sadleir's nephew, William, had been involved in the organisation and drilling of the UVF in the area. In 1921, the IRA in Cavan listed 2 other nephews, Robert and James Sadleir, as, quote, enemy agents. Thomas Sadleir, the blacksmith, 55-year-old blacksmith, hit one of the raiders with a fire tongs and then tried to rush them out of the building. He was then shot dead. The leader of the raiding party later expressed regret for what happened before leaving the forge. On the morning of Sunday, 18th of June 1922, a group of armed men arrived at the house of James Livingston, postmaster for Ardlocher, just to the north of Killishandra. Livingston refused to allow them in, but agreed to hand over a shotgun and revolver, which he passed out through the window. The raiding party then moved out onto the road and fired approximately 4 shots at the house, one of which, a shotgun cartridge, struck the Livingston's 12-year-old daughter, Madge, causing catastrophic injuries to her head, and she died soon afterwards. Madge's cousin, James Woodhouse, from the townland of Rockfield in Port Longfield, later described the violence that Loyalists experienced in West Cavan during the Civil War to the Boundary Commission. Woodhouse, who had since moved to Enniskillen with his wife and young son William, claimed that he was nearly shot twice during the raids and was, quote, threatened by both parties, the Free State soldiers too, unquote. Republicans had killed 2 of his cousins, Maz Livingston and Willie Ryan, a shop assistant at Ballyconnell. Ryan, 21, and originally from Rockfield, was shot dead on 5th of February 1923 in revenge for the killing of an anti-treaty IRA officer, not by Ryan, Michael Cull, who was not shot by Ryan but was shot by a local National Army officer, Frank Dolphin, the month previously. In his evidence to the Commission, Woodhouse claimed, quote, "I know lots of Protestants from Port Longfield who had to clear out and some have left their homes behind them and their houses were burned. This was, quote, the time before there was any sort of law," unquote, indicating a chaotic period but also the restoration of some sense of security thereafter. Woodhouse also remarked that the real period of trouble in his area only commenced in 1922, not before. A few small areas with significant concentrations of Loyalists decided to organise their own defence. On 19th of January 1922, the intelligence officer for the IRA's Midlands Division reported that the UVF in Ballytemple district were organising training sessions in Orange Halls in the parish. In Ballymacue, armed Loyalists took turns guarding the Orange Hall and surrounding area. In April 1922, before the outbreak of the Civil War, the West Cavan Brigade of the IRA reported that 2 volunteers were wounded by 2 British Army officers during a night raid on a house near Cavan. In reality, the men who fired at the 4-man IRA party were Travers Blackley, steward of Farnham Estate, and of course the erstwhile Unionist leader in Cavan, and his 23-year-old son, also Travers, who was an officer in the Rifle Brigade. The Blackleys had been raided before. In July 1920, a group of IRA volunteers surprised the younger Travers Blackley, dressed in his British Army uniform, and forced him to hand over 2 revolvers and some ammunition. Charlie O'Reilly, who in 1922 commanded the IRA's Cavan Company, led both raids. On the second occasion, the Blackleys were prepared to fight. Firing their weapons in their bedclothes, the Blackleys claimed that they had shot 3 men, one of whom left a Mills bomb behind. According to a report on, quote, The Scrap in the Belfast Telegraph, Travers Blackley Sr. was, quote, "a good shot and a keen angler." However, to some extent, this was a Pyrrhic victory. The Blackleys left Cavan for England soon afterwards. Their former enemy, Charlie O'Reilly, served, of course, as a county councillor in Cavan for more than 3 decades. During a period of pronounced tensions with the Northern Irish government, National Army soldiers raided families whose relatives were serving in the Royal Ulster Constabulary of the British Army. In early December 1922, Sergeant Andrew Elliott of the Royal Ulster Rifles was arrested by National Army soldiers while on leave at his home near Belturbet and held prisoner for a number of weeks. Around the same time, Richard and George Pearson from Drug Hill near Belturbet were also arrested by soldiers after loaded firearms were found at their house. On the night of 29th of May 1922, the Church of Ireland rector of Galloon Parish in County Fermanagh, Reverend James Taylor, wrote an urgent letter to Sir Basil Brooke, the County Commandant of the Ulster Special Constabulary and of course the future Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Taylor, who would like to be called the, quote, the fighting parson of the border village of Newton Butler, served as commander of the local B Specials, the exclusively local Protestant part-time force, of course, established in the autumn of 1920. That evening in his rectory, he had met 2 men from the neighbouring districts of Ashfield in County Cavan and Dartry in County Monaghan. These men had come directly from a Loyalist meeting at Drum and claimed to speak for over 1,000 Loyalists. The situation in Monaghan and Cavan was deteriorating rapidly. Threats had been made and a sharp escalation of Republican violence against Loyalists was now likely. The moment had arrived, they said, when the Northern Irish government must prepare for an imminent exodus. Loyalists therefore wanted to know, quote, what consideration would be shown to them by the Ulster government if matters come to the worst and war with the 6 counties broke out, unquote. The gravity of the situation was underlined by an attack that same day by National Army soldiers near Coot Hill on 2 members of the Ashfield Loyalist Defence Committee, landowner Elizabeth Adams and national school teacher Samuel Burrows, who were cycling back home from the meeting at Drum. Burrows, who returned fire with a revolver, was badly wounded in the face. The response from the RIC, Inspector General, the commander of the RIC, Colonel Wickham, was, we can't do anything for these Loyalists, but if we do need to invade the south, they might be useful. The repeated failure of Loyalists in Rathkenny to organise a coherent defence underlines the absence of effective Loyalist leadership in the area. Harry Flood, the alleged leadership of Loyalist paramilitaries in Rathkenny, had no military experience. The Floods were committed to the Ulster movement, and Robert Flood, Harry's brother, was an especially capable soldier. He had enlisted as a private soldier in 9th Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers, was subsequently commissioned, promoted to captain, and awarded the Military Cross at the Battle of Ypres in autumn 1917. However, Robert Flood was killed on the Western Front at the end of that year. Loyalists in places such as Ballinagall and County Monaghan could draw upon experienced and capable British Army non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals, and successfully resisted IRA control of that area. By contrast, the Loyalists of Rathkenny persisted in meeting in the same place despite being repeatedly attacked there by the IRA. Nevertheless, the suggestion by Reverend Taylor that Loyalists in the Coot Hill area were well armed and considering, quote, cutting their way through, unquote, to Northern Ireland if the worst came to pass gives a sense of some resilient strength in the area, but in May 1922. The worst, however, did not come to pass. The Loyalist experience in East Cavan during the Civil War was less traumatic than that of West Cavan, where anti-treaty forces were more active in late 1922. In evidence to the Boundary Commission, Reverend Thomas Walmsley observed that, quote, troublesome times, unquote, in Northwest Cavan and North Leitrim had further depleted the already small Protestant population in those areas. In some places there had been, quote, a stampede of Protestants, unquote. County Leitrim suffered a relatively higher population decline than the three Ulster counties, even if patterns of migration from that county were well established before the revolutionary period. Nevertheless, political violence and the collapse of state authority likely did accelerate to some extent that trend. And Northwest Cavan's migration patterns there were quite similar to those of Leitrim, much more similar to Leitrim than East Cavan, for example. To conclude then, of the three Ulster counties excluded from Northern Ireland, Cavan was the most restrained or hesitant in terms of Loyalist paramilitary activity or defence. The absence of a more militant and active Loyalist network was a result of both calculation and chance. A more thinly spread rural Protestant population had obvious consequences for the prospects of paramilitary groups. The defence group in Billis, that's a long, long way from Northern Ireland if you're looking for sort of occasional support or even networks that you can draw solace for, well, both in terms of practical support, but also a line of retreat if, for example, there was serious escalation of violence, an escalation which didn't come to pass. Cavan's most capable patrician leaders, aristocratic leaders, were either dead or deliberately absented themselves from Loyalist politics in the county. The UVF in Cavan also disproportionately relied upon leaders from the gentry compared to Monaghan and Donegal. A capable junior officer, non-commissioned officer class was absent. It is possible that if the IRA's campaign had been more violent, of course, these men may have emerged. For the most part, the quietum of Cavan Loyalists worked. Neighbourly relations were often quite strong. The attack of William Rooney was strongly resented, including by his Catholic nationalist neighbours. So there's also something there in terms of the absence of violence leading to perhaps a need for more research in terms of neighbourliness and the idea of neighbours resisting or disliking violence against certain members of the community. There's something certainly going on there in terms of restraint in Cavan. Fortunately for Loyalists, the IRA in the more populous eastern part of the county lacked the type of hardline leaders seen elsewhere, including in the west of the county. Terrible or terrorising events can have a disproportionate effect, however, on the confidence of a community, and calculations, of course, when it comes to resistance. Protestant confidence in Northwest Cavan appears to have collapsed after the murders of John Finlay and John Harrison. Instead of serving as a useful deterrent then, the recruitment of UVF company in the preceding decade before the War of Independence in the Bowen Boy area, led, of course, by Robert Johnston, fostered greater suspicion, resentment, and ultimately violence. It was not a good idea because they didn't have the force. It was never going to be a realistic deterrent. Cavan Loyalists, similar to Donegal, suffered the misfortune of anti-treaty forces taking over much of the county in mid-late 1922. Without the authority of a state, and indeed a sympathetic police force, which they could support or simply tolerate, Loyalists were lost. But this period of disorder and lawlessness was quite a brief one. Finally, a lack of bark or bite in Cavan Loyalism should not be interpreted as an absence of a deep-felt commitment to Ulster and the British Empire. Indeed, it's another lecture, but there are a number of prominent Cavan Loyalists who, of course, stand for election in Northern Ireland in the 1920s. William Coote, although he's moved to South Tyrone first to Clocker, but John Nixon, of course, who's from the Gradam area, and indeed, there's a number of politicians who emerge in later years who are often very critical of James Craig for his attempts, for example, to have a pact with Michael Collins. So we should be careful about suggesting that there is not a sincere belief in loyalism within the frontier counties, within the three counties. There often is. The new Irish state, however, which for the most part, for Loyalists, for the most part, of course, safeguarded property rights, Protestant schools, and remained within the Commonwealth, was, of course, an entity which many Loyalists could reluctantly accept then in 1923. Thank you very much. Cheers.